Hello and welcome back to another lesson on AP Psychology's Unit 9, which is for Social Psychology. In this lesson, we'll be covering some of psychology's most famous experiments and research studies. We begin with the test on conformity. The conformity test looks as follows. You see a line at the top of this image, and you're simply asked, which line does it match to, line 1, 2, or 3? Now, when this actually occurs, you're in the presence of other volunteers who are actually participants in on the study, so you would be the individual who's truly being tested. And after a couple of visualizations such as this, you would begin to trust the answers of the other members of the group. And so if they told you, hey, this is line 2, hey, it's line 2, line 2, line 2, and everybody seems to be getting the correct answer that you're also getting, they then flash forward a couple of times after some built-up confidence, and they show you this one. But this time, instead of the participants identifying the correct line, they all intentionally choose the incorrect line. In this case, let's say line 1, and then line 1, and then line 1, and then line 1. And now it's your turn, and you're tasked with identifying excuse me, which line is correct. Well, initially, you were thinking, maybe line 2. However, everybody before you who has been correct chose line 1, so now you're not sure what to do, and you end up choosing line 1 out of conformity. So, what is conformity? Well, conformity is simply when people yield to real or imagined social pressure. Now, what does that actually mean? It means that in a time of uncertainty, you can be influenced by those around you when you're not sure what to do. So Solomon Asch, leader of the conformity line experiments in the 1950s, ended up showing that a little more than 1 out of every 3 people end up conforming in this situation with the line test. Now, so there's a few variations, of this experiment, but ultimately what they found was that people tend to go along with others a scary percentage of the time when they're not sure of what they should do. Now, it puts into question group size, group unanimity in terms of how concise or coherent the group is on picking the same choice or choosing the same answer. Obviously, you should be thinking about the results of something like conformity. It goes way beyond something as simple as the line test. So people have often made parallel associations to things like the rise of the Third Reich and the Nazi regime. Think about people who are just following orders because that's what everyone else is doing and seeing levels of conformity. So there's a couple reasons why people tend to conform. I'm going to show you kind of those two options. So usually it falls down to one of two things. Either you want to be liked or you want to be correct. And so we call this the normative influence. It means you're conforming generally to social norms because you're afraid of the consequences socially. So rather than being wrong or rather than either being wrong or being disliked, you end up conforming. And so with normative influence, it focuses on wanting to be accepted, wanting to be liked by those around you, whereas the informational influence is talking about conformity in terms of how you should behave in a questionable or ambiguous situation. So you want to be correct. Think about it, if you were to go to a fancy restaurant. At this fancy restaurant, you're going to be having a multi-course meal. You have a glass for water, you have a wine glass, you've got a fork and a knife and a spoon, very traditional, but then you've got another fork and knife and spoon. And you're just like, oh my gosh, there's so much silverware. What do I do? Which one am I supposed to eat my salad with? Or which one do I eat my soup with? And so you're not sure. This is your first time at a super fancy restaurant where you have multiple pieces of silverware. So you look around. And you look around to your friend who brought you and they've been here before, and you look to see which spoon do they eat their soup with and which fork do they eat their salad with. And you copy them because why? You want to be correct. You don't want to be shown, you don't want to be in the situation where you've got all the silverware and then you're using the wrong one, because how is that going to have you perceived? You might want to be both liked and be correct. So in this case, you could be falling victim to both forms of influence. So that's conformity in a nutshell. All right, let's go to the second one. Second big experiment is from Stanley Milgram. It's an experiment that tests obedience and it's technically known as Milgram's electric shock experiments. It's known as a very shocking experiment, no pun intended, or maybe pun is intended, for a variety of reasons, but it's partly because of the results, how shocking the results were. From a numerical, statistical standpoint, they were pretty high, and also because the experiment involved what was perceived as participants shocking another individual, even though they didn't actually shock them, for the most part. So, it's a test of obedience, but it's masking. The test of obedience is masked by another test dealing with memory. And so what is obedience? Well, it's a form of compliance that occurs when people follow direct commands, and usually it involves some kind of person in a position of authority or perceived authority, because that's what we have in this experiment. So the psychologists involved before Milgram's experiment from Yale predicted that a very small percentage of people would actually show signs of obedience. Now they happen to be quite wrong, and so the initial experiment is set up in a way to try to get individuals to be coerced into obeying an individual in their room who's wearing a white lab coat. And that person is seen as a person in a position of authority, i.e. like a medical practitioner, a doctor, and so their opinion is heavily weighted and causes the subjects in the experiment to oftentimes obey. So, excuse me. Let's see what happens. In the setup of the experiment, two roles were given out. One role is called the teacher, and one role is called the learner. Now, the individuals who are actually being experimented on in this test are always going to receive the same role, which is the role of the teacher. The role of the teacher is quite simple. They're to read a list of words to the learner through an intercom system, and the learner is going to give what they think is the correct response of a word that matches a word from a previous list they were exposed to. So for example, if you saw a list of words that had on one line dog and beside that a hyphen and it said food, if I gave you the word dog as the teacher, I would expect you would choose the word food out of a list of words I provide for you, because that's the association that you know. So the way this experiment is presented is a word association to test for memory. Now, it was meant to be deceptive because the true intentions could not be told until after the fact. And so what the participant doesn't realize, keep in mind again, the participant is the teacher. What they don't know is that the person on the other end of this little intercom system is actually in on the experiment and is going to intentionally get questions wrong so that we can see what the teacher ends up doing. So, subject gets a question wrong, and the teacher is informed by the person in the room in the white lab coat that they need to now administer a small electric shock to the learner as a punishment for getting the incorrect answer. And so, initially, there's a crisis of conscience because you find out as the teacher that you're about to start administering mild electric shocks, but people tend to administer them. And then when there's another incorrect answer, they're told the shocks must increase in voltage. And so they continue down this path. But eventually they start having some questions, and they may hesitate, they may pause, they may choose to not go on. And that's when this authoritarian figure in the room decides to speak up. And so these are some of the verbal prods from that experimenter. You can read them. And essentially it boils down to a couple of vague statements. And oftentimes, this was enough that led the teacher to continue administering the electric shocks, even when they saw on the machine that they were using that the shocks were considered dangerous or high levels of voltage. So let's take a look at the results. The initial shock was 15 volts, and it went as high as 450 volts. And this is why the results of the Milgram test are often labeled as shocking. It's because 65% of the participants involved in the study, they went all the way to 450 volts. Some of them may have hesitated and stopped along the way, but because of that authoritarian figure in the room, they were convinced that they could keep going and kind of feel freedom of the burden of responsibility that they may be injuring someone on the other end of it. Now again, keep in mind, there were never actually any shocks being administered to the learner when this setup was presented, but the teacher in that role, they didn't know that. And so 65% went quite far, all the way to the end, labeled XXX, like fatal level voltage of electricity. It's quite high, definitely enough to cause significant injury or even death. But if you look, there weren't really even any questions until you got into the realm of 300 volts of electricity. So that was quite high and quite shocking. The question you have to ask yourself is, what would you do? Are you considered special? 65% of people went all the way to 450 volts. It was 26 people out of 40. And then in a separate study, 85% went all the way to button 10 on a 10-button shock system. That was 34 people out of 40. So on a 10-button system, rather than showing, hey, this is 15 volts, this is 30 volts, just putting buttons 1 to 10, 34 out of 40 people went all the way to the end. So quite shocking results nonetheless. Now, we move to the final study, which is known as the Stanford Prison Study or Stanford Prison Simulation. This was led by Philip Zimbardo and involved 24 students, both prisoner and guard roles. The prisoners and guards were divided. I'm simplifying here because you guys should look into some more of this study anyways if you complete my assignment. But essentially, the group is divided and the study is meant to seem as real as possible for both the prisoners and the guards. Guards were told of only one rule, which is they could not physically assault prisoners. Unfortunately, this study, or I should say fortunately, this study was stopped short after only 6 days. It was planned to last longer, around 2 weeks' time. However, the study devolved very quickly into a kind of a dangerous scenario for both guards and prisoners, and as a result, the study was brought to an end much faster than initially planned. What was the study about? Well, it was primarily to test the idea of situational pressure and social roles. And so how should someone behave if they're in a certain position? How are they expected to behave? In this day and age, in 2021, wow, we're 2021, we have a certain expectation about many professions and how people should act. And so if you're talking about a police officer or a firefighter or a guard or an EMT officer or a doctor, a prisoner even, we have certain ideas. Excuse me. We have certain ideas, social roles, on how people are expected to behave. You would expect a guard is probably someone who is going to be cruel and kind of controlling, and you might expect a prisoner to be very subservient and kind of focused on commands. And so what this experiment showed, even though it's often been heavily criticized and there's been a lot of follow-up controversy about the legitimacy of the experiment, which is something you should be aware of, the experiment initially tried to suggest the situational pressure influence. How situational pressures could lead a very normalized person, a decent human being, to begin to behave in very scary, sinister, repugnant ways. So you can find a lot of literature about the Stanford Prison Study. It's extremely controversial. There's been information to suggest that guards were actually acting and they were in on the experiment the whole time. There's others that contradict that, so you might have to do some digging. But originally, up until just a handful of years ago, the Stanford Prison Study was believed to be a bit more legitimate, I think, than it is believed to be now. And that's okay. But there have been parallels. For example, in the early 2000s, the American prison that was set up in the Middle East, Abu GHARIB prison, which often involved guards being very sadistic and cruel towards prisoners who were believed to have information about terrorists or connection to terrorists, so they were to be interrogated. Well, these guards ended up using cameras to document a lot of their experience here, which was a pretty dumb decision, but it ended up leading into some military scandal and embarrassment over some of the behaviors that were involved. So the Stanford Prison Study, regardless of how legitimate it is and how controversial it is, it has other parallels that are done in the real world, not as an experiment. Of course, you're not going to be doing these reading quizzes. So the second half of this lesson is about behavior in groups and the social task influence, primarily focused on bystander effect and polarization. So you guys know what groups are, so I'm just going to kind of go through some of these pretty quickly. But a group is simply where you have two or more people who interact or who are interdependent upon one another. And so there is a situation known as the bystander effect, which is often when people are less likely to provide needed help or aid if they're in a group rather than when they're alone. And so Darley and Latane did a study here to look at the bystander effect in a cubicle workplace, and they set up situations with fake intercom systems, but faking individuals who would have seizures and seeing who would respond. And the more crowded the environment, the less response there was from people who were offering aid or help. And so the reason of this behavior is blamed on the diffusion of responsibility and then the bystander effect. Diffusion of responsibility is when you feel that because of your group, you are less likely or less responsible for the outcome of someone who may need help. So in a group setting, you might have the mindset that someone else is going to help, so you don't, okay? The consequences of this could be catastrophic. So it's no different than driving down the road and witnessing a car accident and having the mindset that somebody else is probably calling 911, so I'm just going to keep driving. Now, I'm not saying you should always get out of your car and try to help people in need. It depends on a lot of factors. But you may come across a situation at some point in your life as a driver or just as a living human being where someone around you needs help and you choose not to offer that help because you're affiliated with a group. And everybody in that group is kind of feeling the same ideas running through their mind. I'm less responsible because there's other people here. And so the danger would be that if everybody has that mentality, who's the one who's going to call 911? Who's the one who's going to offer help for that individual in the emergency because everyone is thinking someone else is going to do it? So how do you fight against the bystander effect? It's actually pretty simple. If you're in an emergency and you need help, you need to be very specific in singling out another individual's help. So you need to say, hey, person with the red bag, yeah, I need your help. Please, I'm in trouble. I need some help. You can't just say, help me, help me, help me. You got to be very specific. That way somebody feels more involved because that person may look around and say, hey, is there anyone else wearing a red shirt or holding a red bag? And they may notice quickly that there's not. They're talking to you. So now if you still ignore that person, you're just a cruel human being. Another example would be if you're shopping, you're out at a store somewhere, and you notice that somebody left a child in their car alone, or maybe an animal. Probably more likely to see that, an animal in a car alone. And maybe it's a very hot, sunny day. Well, there's a risk that that animal could have breathing problems or that child could have breathing problems and be unable to continue breathing after an extended duration. Unfortunately, there's been a lot of tragedies where people would have breathing difficulties, have heat strokes in their car, even when temperatures outside are 50 degrees. So the risk is very high to overheat and have breathing problems, and you feel like, man, I need to do something. But there's a lot of people around, so you wonder, has anybody else walked by? Has anybody else tried to intervene or do something? And you don't know. And so these can be very tricky situations to navigate. Your best bet would be to call 911. And unless there looks to be some kind of immediate concern, then you may have to act before even 911 could arrive. Other topics here, we have forms of aggression, instrumental aggression, and hostile aggression. And so when an individual is using intentional harmful behavior to achieve a goal, this is seen as instrumental aggression. For example, if you try to rob a bank for money, the goal is to get money. You're aggressive as a means to get the money. You're not having a goal to try to hurt others. That's why it's called instrumental aggression. You're using an instrument to be aggressive. In this case, it could be a gun. Now, hostile aggression is a little bit different. This time, the intent is to actually use harmful behavior, or the goal is to actually hurt someone, cause injury, or death. And so, if you rob a bank not because you want money or to scare people, but because your intent is to truly harm someone, that is a bit different. That's hostile aggression. If you slam your car door out of frustration when you're upset, when the car's not starting, you know the car's not going to start if you slam the door. So it's a form of hostility for a need of a cathartic moment. I'm slamming the door because I'm angry. If you curse or yell something when you have a small injury, when somebody, you stump your toe and you yell something, you know that yelling is not going to make you feel any better, but it's a way to convey some of that hostility that, ow, that really hurt. I want people to know that really hurt. So it's hostile aggression. Now, it's possible that you have something that starts as instrumental aggression and then becomes hostile aggression. The way that works would be, for example, in my chosen example here, a soldier firing of a weapon at an enemy to defend territory could turn into a raging, hostile, aggressive act, desire to kill the enemy if, say, the comrade who's also helping defend is shot. So picture it like this. You and another person are shooting bullets into a general area to keep people back, but then the person beside you is shot and killed. And suddenly now you're not just firing defense bullets, you're actually looking to kill others as well. That would be a hostile act. Some other elements of human interaction that involve group productivity is the idea of social loafing. Social loafing is what people do in group projects where they feel like, I don't have to work as hard. The reason you don't work as hard is because you've got some diffusion of responsibility. You get a group of people, so why should you work as hard? Other people are there also sharing the burden, sharing the load. And so if you hate group work, it might be because you always get stuck with social loafers, people who don't carry their weight and hope to just kind of mooch and leech off of your hard, focused attention. If you enjoy group work, it might be because at some point you've been a social loafer and you know that other people are going to carry the load. You can eliminate social loafing by having a more cohesive group that's more equally bonded by a variety of factors to make people feel less likely to let the group down. Now, speaking of groups, it just so happens that when you're in a group, sometimes you're more likely to succeed and perform stronger, and other times being in a group may actually hurt your behavior. So we have two terms here. One is social facilitation. You actually can perform differently in the presence of other people compared to when you're alone, and you may perform either better or worse depending on the type of task. So typically in the presence of others, you could perform better on a task if it's a very simple task or a very rehearsed task. If you're a performer in school theater, a lot of people would say that maybe they don't want you to come on the opening night because they want to get their initial jitters out, the bugs out, even though they've been rehearsing. By the end of the week, maybe the performance is even more well rehearsed. It's more simplified for the individuals to remember their lines, so they perform better in the presence of others. Now, if you're doing something that is brand new or extremely complicated, the presence of others may actually cause you to choke and, as a result, perform worse. It's also worth noting that we experience what's called social inhibition. Social inhibition is that in the presence of other people around us, we may actually restrain or alter our behavior for fear of being judged, or because we're afraid of the possible disapproval of others. If we have too much social inhibition, we may actually come across as unfriendly or rude. The reason for this would be that we have actually altered our behavior so much that we're coming across to others in a very callous way. However, if we don't have enough social inhibition, we may act extremely inappropriate and obnoxious because we're not at all afraid of any kind of social judgment or fear of being reprimanded or disapproved. We also have some more group decision-making elements. In a group, oftentimes people who share similar views can actually cause one another's views to become even more polarized. This is called group polarization. And let's say, for example, that you have a group of individuals who are talking about politics. It's a group of Democrats, and one person begins to suggest free college tuition for everyone, free health care for everyone, free, I don't know, all kinds of most extreme takes that they could possibly have with the Democratic Party. And others just kind of showed up there. They were just kind of more of a centrist Democrat. They were not necessarily of the mindset that everything should be free for all. But what happens is the discussion ends up polarizing everyone and takes everyone even further one way, one direction to getting, hey, let's get free everything for everybody. And so the dominant point of view produces this shift towards a more extreme direction. So now everybody is, super, I'm feeling the burn. We want to get all of these things for everyone. We also can experience groupthink. Groupthink is what happens when rational critical thinking is often suspended in favor of promoting the cohesiveness of the group. And so this was seen in an event like the JFK Bay of Pigs invasion, Cuban Missile Crisis time period of America, 1960s, kind of some disastrous moves. The members who suggested to handle the situation with the Bay of Pigs differently often were going against the cohesive nature that brought the group together. And so when you have groupthink, critical thinking and discussion is often suspended because members of the group tend to treat those individuals as outliers who are not thinking clearly, and they want to preserve the group and the group's cohesiveness. And this makes the groupthink even more dangerous because then it leads to bad decisions that have not truly been evaluated. I know this is seeming like a lot of stuff, and we are now at the end of this on the last slide. The final element to share is about group competition. You see here it says realistic group conflict theory. This is another fairly famous experiment involving a summer camp for children known as the Robbers Cave experiments. And basically at this summer camp, the groups of children that arrived were quickly placed in various groups to begin to bring up discussion of bias for both the in-group and the out-group, as well as to raise issues of ethnocentrism and superordinate goals. Ethnocentrism is a belief of group superiority, so if you believe you're better than others because, say, you belong to a group of Caucasians or a group of Republicans or Democrats or rich people or poor people or whatever it is, if you have that belief of group superiority, then you are showing signs of ethnocentrism. And so at this summer camp, the kids were divided into groups and they began to have competitive tasks, which brought out ethnocentristic views, which basically meant that the groups began to feel more superior to the others, and they began to hoard resources at the camp, basically doing things like putting up guards and preventing kids from playing certain sports around, say, a baseball field to practice dodgeball, or there was some vandalism that was taking place. And in the end, you had groups of little boys, little kids, who began to kind of taunt and torment the other individual groups. And so the counselors here and the researchers, they decided that they got to figure out a way to bring everybody back. How do we bring everybody back to reduce the ethnocentrism? And what they did was they created a superordinate goal. Superordinate goal is a mutually shared goal only achievable through cooperation, which meant that these little groups, they called themselves the Eagles and the Rattlers, and there's probably a couple others. They had to all work together in order to complete the task and realize that no group was more superior than the other. And so some questions here were raised about in-group and out-group favoritism. It's very common for us to favor our in-group. Those are our peers that we identify with, and then to treat others a bit differently who do not belong to our group. And so that is called out-group derogation. And that's pretty much going to do it for lesson number 2. It's going to come in right under 30 minutes. So hopefully you will take away some of these important studies. This should be the longest lesson of the unit, so hopefully you've bared with me. And as always, signing off now. Peace out.